Hello all. Today we're going to be talking about neuropsychological assessment. Now this is something that I've added to the book's information about because I actually am trained to do neuropsychological assessments and did them while I was in graduate school. So I'm going to walk you through the basics of the different types of assessments we tend to do and also talk about specific tests that we might use. So we're going to start with intelligence testing. So intelligence testing is used not only to actually determine intelligence, obviously, but also used as sort of a point of comparison or baseline for various types of assessments that we might do. So the gold standard really is the Weschler Adult Intelligence Scale, also known as the WAIS. It is really looking at a wide variety of different types of intelligence, and has different tasks to measure each of those as well. So there is the WAIS block design. So this is a task where you actually physically have some blocks that you use, and the participants have to actually reconstruct a diagram that's placed in front of them. So this gives it a lot of ability to think on the fly, things along those lines. Similarities will probably flash you back to your SAT days. And so it asks participants what are some of the ways that terms might be related. So, for example, you would ask them, how are an orange and a banana related? And you'd be looking for an answer like, they're both fruits. So these get more complex, as you can see, as you go through things. So something like, a fly and a tree related, you're looking for they're both living things. So it has to be a little more abstract. Digit span gets at working memory. So you have people repeat numbers to you. Now there's very specific directions in terms of how you as the test giver have to implement this. And so you have to give a second between each. So for example, if I were going to say 2, 6, 5, I wouldn't say it that quickly. I would say 2, 6, 5, and then have them repeat it back to me. The idea here is you don't want them to just be using working memory and spit it right back out at you, but that they're having to actually sort of work with the information and remember it. After you get through all of those, you then do a backwards test where I would say 2, 1, and they would have to repeat it back 1, 2. Again, this is, can they manipulate that information? Matrix reasoning asks them to complete a pattern. Vocabulary asks them to define terms. So things like, bed. What is a bed? It seems sort of silly. But you start really easily and you work up to much more complex terms. So this is getting at some really solidified knowledge. Arithmetic is your ability to do mental arithmetic. It really ends up being another task of working memory. So if eggs cost 60 cents a dozen, what does 1 egg cost? Right? You're dividing 60 cents by 12 in that moment. And so you have to be able to do that on the fly. When I was learning to do the WAIS, I actually had to give it to someone. So I gave it to my now husband, then boyfriend. And he was a math major in college. And so he did these so quickly, I couldn't even start and stop the stopwatch quick enough. So it really was an interesting take compared to folks I tested later who didn't have that innate ability. Symbol search is where you check whether each of the 2 symbols on the right matches any of the symbols on the left. So you have to go through and actually match these up. There are 60 items you're supposed to go through and try to find, and you have 120 seconds. So most people don't get through the whole thing. Visual puzzles is one of the newer subtests for the WAIS 4, which is the current version and which came out, I believe, in 2009. So it's about 10 years old at the time I'm making this video. So which of these pieces go together to make this puzzle? So you would have to sit and actually figure out which is which here. And so in this case, it's piece 1, because that would create your bottom corner. Piece 3, that creates your top. And then piece 6, which you'd have to rotate to create your bottom right-hand corner. WAIS information, again, is going to get at some knowledge that you would have learned in school. So what is the capital of Italy? How many minutes does it take for sunlight to reach the earth? Again, these start pretty easy and get harder. And we're looking at that knowledge. And also it's really a test of memory as well, of can you recall these things that you've learned perhaps in high school. Coding, now, if you'll notice, this is in a different language than English. This is the only version I could find online. Obviously, the WAIS is proprietary and they don't want to share everything. But here what you do is there's a symbol associated with a number, and you have to write the symbol underneath the number. And you can't just go through and like write all the 9s first, for example. You have to do it in order. So this is a test of working memory, how quickly you can work through this and how quickly you can remember these things. Again, lots of items, most people don't get to do that. Letter number sequencing is going to flash us back to our quick memory, but instead of just having numbers this time, we're going to have both letters and numbers, and instead of just spitting it back to us, participants now have the more tricky task of repeating all of the letters in a row and all the numbers in a row in specific sequence. So 3, the A would have to be 3AD, but obviously that gets trickier when you see the one below it. So you really have to manipulate that information in your working memory instead of just regurgitating it. Figure weights is also a new task for the WAIS 4. Again, not so new now. But essentially you have to kind of do mental math and figure out what each of these things represent and figure out, okay, if these two things are equivalent, then what would it take to actually fill in the question mark on the second one. So you essentially have to figure out what unit each of these things represents. So in terms of comprehension, here again, you're asking people to use their knowledge, but also to really think through things, use moral and ethical reasoning. So, for example, this is the first question. What should you do if you find an envelope that is sealed, addressed, and has a stamp on it? It really should be pretty simple, right? You just put it in the mail for the person. But, you know, if someone has some difficulties in their frontal lobes, for example, they might not be able to get to that answer as quickly. In terms of cancellation, here is another task where there's a lot of items where people probably aren't going to get through them all. And so what you're doing is you're looking for these symbols in this specific sequence. So this is a measure not only of processing speed, but also of executive function. Can you inhibit from crossing these things out? You know, can you inhibit yourself from selecting the yellow square when you really need the red square, for example? And then picture completion. You're asking the person to look at the picture and identify what's missing. So in this case, it is the lead from the pencil, for example, but that is, again, get much more complex as you go through. Another test that might be used to try to get at some of these things is the Wide Range Achievement Test, or WRAT. So it does things like asking you to read words out loud, asking you to do some other basic tasks. And this is a nice, quick way to get at achievement. There's also something called the WIAT, which is made with the Weschler, and so those can sort of map more easily onto each other as well, but is much more time intensive than the WRAT. Now we're going to talk about tests of language. So verbal fluency is simply your ability to essentially get verbal things out and connect things from your memory to your ability to speak. So animal naming, you give people 60 seconds, and I've seen this done multiple different ways. You could just ask them to name animals. You can ask them to name animals with 4 legs, and they just come up with as many as they can during that time. FAS is the same thing, but you ask them to name words that start with each of those letters. And yes, these letters are purposely chosen because they can elicit some 4-letter words. And so the idea is to see how much folks can inhibit from using those particular words, in addition to how many words they'll come up with. Or do they even choose to inhibit, right? The Boston naming test gives you pictures, and you just have to name them. Again, sounds like a really easy task, but more difficult for individuals who struggle with some of the disorders we'll talk about throughout the semester. This is the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Examination. The Boston naming test is one piece of that. It is an overall large-scale diagnosis for people who might have language disabilities or damage in those areas of growth. In terms of visuospatial tasks, probably the most famous is this one. It's called the Rey-O often, or the complex figure task. You have the person try to replicate this very complex figure. And again, if they're having motor difficulties or visual difficulties related to brain injury or some perceptual things, this can turn out looking very different. Another one you can have them do is brief visuospatial memory test, or the BVMT. The most recent version is the BVMT-R for revised. And here there are figures that, again, you just ask them to copy. Clock drawing is another simple task you can do to get at this. You just simply ask them to draw a clock. If they're having hemisphere issues, where one hemisphere of their brain might be functioning but the other isn't, you sometimes find they draw the clock all on one side, for example. That can be really helpful diagnostically. Now, in terms of executive function and control, these are things that are going to be controlled by the prefrontal cortex of your brain, things like inhibition, organization, personality. We often say that this is sort of the CEO of your brain. One of the things you can do here is called trails. It's kind of connect the dots, essentially, but you have to do it in a specific order. So part A, trails A, you just do numbers. Trails B, you do number then letter, number then letter. They're not as easy as this, clearly. They're much more complex, and you kind of have to move your hand all over the page, and you're not allowed to pick up your pencil while you're doing it. You try to do this quickly as you can. A much more complex and intensive executive function test is Raven's progressive matrices. Similar to some of the tasks we looked at on the WAIS, these will ask you to select the image that would fit within that circle based on the other squares. This one's for you. The Wisconsin Scarred Sort task is, again, a longer task. With this, you have target cards, and then you ask participants to sort them into piles based on those target cards. The problem is part of the task is you keep changing the rules on them. And it's to see, can they adapt and figure it out? Do they get really angry, right? What happens when you do this? It is a little mean, right? But it's really helpful diagnostically. The Stroop, you may have learned about if you took other psychology classes. So in the Stroop, your task is to say the color, not read the word. So if you look at the top one, obviously this would be super easy because you're just reading the word that's the same color. When you actually see the Stroop, it's like this bottom one. So instead of reading green, red, blue, my task here would be to say red, green, yellow, blue, orange, green, red, green, purple, blue, black, orange. That's actually kind of difficult for me, and you want to get people to try to go as quickly as possible. There are larger executive function systems that people will use that can be done if, again, you really think this is the area of functioning that's problematic. Memory is a one that we use in a whole bunch of different tasks. Memory, unfortunately, is one of the things that gets impaired in a lot of different ways, not only dementia, but also head injuries, for example. So wordless and story memory are examples here. So wordless, you would just give people a list of words that they have to say back to you. There are many different versions of this. Again, similar to when we were doing digit span, you want to leave that second pause in between each word. Often you give the wordless multiple times to see how much they can retain. Story memory is often easier for people. You tell them a story and they have to remember essentially the general plot line of it. I still remember one of the ones that I gave quite frequently when I was doing these assessments about Anna Thompson from South Boston, for example. And so they, again, people like things in a narrative, so this is often easier for folks. You might give digit span here as well. And then the BVMT and the Rey-O figures that we talked about before actually have memory components. When you get to the memory component for the Rey, people often get really upset. Because again, that's that really complicated figure that often people have trouble just replicating, and now you've asked them to recall it from memory. And people get a little, it's difficult, as it's meant to be. One of the things that we want to look at, unfortunately, as we do this, is effort. Are the participant, patient, client, whoever we're working with, actually putting in adequate effort? Unfortunately, people do sometimes have motivation to fake these things, right? Whether it's for disability, whether it's in a lawsuit. So we want to just make sure that they're actually giving adequate effort. Another thing is that sometimes people just are so depressed, anxious, overwhelmed that they can't give the effort that they want to give. And so this can help parse that out as well. So this is the test of memory malingering, or the TOMM, and it is written by a guy called Tom Tombaugh. So take that as you will. But what this is it's a set of images that you show to folks. And then after you show it to them, you show them another set of images where there are 2 images per page, and they have to tell you which one they've seen prior. This sounds really complex, right? And seems like it's a lot to do because there are 60 images per. However, human minds are actually really good at remembering images, and then the task we're asking them to do is actually a recall task, or a recognition task, sorry, instead of a recall task. So it's so much easier for us to recognize something than to actually, if we made someone like recall and draw out the image, for example. So this is actually pretty easy, to the point that if you get more than about 5 wrong, it's probably you are either having effort problems or you might be malingering or faking. So this is something that's really helpful to give for that reason. It doesn't take that long to administer. It seems more complex than it is. The one time I did have someone who scored as problematic on this, it was a problem of effort. He was just so depressed, he couldn't adequately give effort at that point in time. So we actually decided not to test him, sent him for therapy for his depression, and then later on down the road did test him when he could give adequate effort, and then we were able to accurately diagnose him. So I hope this was helpful to go over some of these and look at some examples in more detail. I will look forward to talking with you also throughout the semester about some other topics.